The wave was not what I remember most. I know that sounds wrong. A wall of water tall enough to swallow mountains, moving at a speed that made the wind seem patient, bearing down on the greatest island civilization the world had ever produced. That should be the thing. That should be the image I carry. And I do carry it. I will carry it until whatever comes after carrying things, but it is not the first thing that surfaces when I reach back to that day. What I remember most is the moment before the wave. The moment that was not a moment, the pause that had no duration, the instant when the world stopped being the world and became something else, something I have spent the rest of my life failing to find words for, and will fail again now, and will try anyway, because the trying is the only thing left to do with it. I was on the water when it happened, a merchant run, the kind I had made 40 times in 40 years, the kind that had become so familiar that the sea felt like a room I lived in rather than a force I navigated. 3 days out from the eastern coast of Numenor, cargo below, crew of 9, the kind of clear autumn morning that makes a sailor feel the world is well arranged. And then it wasn't. My name is Aldemir. I was born in the port city of Ravenna on the eastern shore of Numenor, in the 283rd year of the Second Age, to a family that had worked the sea for 6 generations. I learned to sail before I learned to read. I understood the specific grammar of water and wind and weather before I understood the grammar of words. The sea was not a mystery to me. The sea was the most known thing in my life, the thing I understood most completely and trusted most completely and returned to most consistently across a life that had more than its share of things I didn't understand and couldn't trust. I tell you this, so you understand what it meant when the sea stopped being the sea. But I am getting ahead of myself. There is a before, and the before matters, and I will not shortchange it, because the before is what gives the moment its full weight. Numenor. I need to tell you what Numenor was before I tell you what happened to it, because the knowing of what was lost is the only way to feel the scale of the losing. Not the history of it, not the lineage of kings or the politics of the last years, though those matter and I will come to them. The texture of it, what it was like to be alive on that island, to sail into its harbors, to stand in its cities, and feel the specific quality of a place where everything had been made with complete attention and long patience by people who had more time than men were ever supposed to have, and had used that time well. The harbor at Ravenna on a summer morning, the specific quality of light that came off the water there, different from any other harbor I have known before or since. Something in the way the hills above channeled the early sun onto the bay that produced a brightness that was also warmth, that arrived on the face as both light and heat simultaneously in a way that simple geography should not have been able to produce. The smell of the docks, salt and timber, and the particular sharp resin of the boats freshly caulked, and underneath all of that, the smell of the city itself, bread from the morning markets, and the smoke of cook fires, and the stone, warm stone, that had been absorbing sun for centuries, and gave it back slowly all through the night. I had sailed into that harbor perhaps 200 times across my life. I knew every approach, every sandbar, every current. I knew the faces of the harbor masters, and their assistants, and their assistants' assistants. I knew which dockside merchants could be trusted, and which required watching, and which required both simultaneously. I knew the specific sound of Ravenna waking up in the morning, the sequence of it, the fishing boats first, then the market carts, then the bells of the upper city arriving, later than you would expect, as if the upper city had decided that dignity required a certain indifference to the hour. I loved it with the specific love of someone who knows a place completely, and has found in that complete knowing something that functions as peace. The upper city on a clear day, the towers of the Meneltama, visible from the harbour on mornings when the air was clean enough, that great peak standing above everything, the way that things stand above everything, when they have been there long enough that the landscape has organized itself around them. I had never climbed it. It was not a place for people like me, not forbidden, but simply belonging to a different kind of attention than a merchant sailor's daily attention. I had looked at it from below for 40 years and found in the looking a quality that I could not name as religious because I was not a religious man, but that functioned the way I understood religion to function for those who had it. The sense of something that had been there before you and would be there after you, and in that persistence offered something that comfort was a small word for. The markets of the lower city, where you could find things that existed nowhere else in the world, the specific products of a civilization that had been refining its crafts and its agriculture and its understanding of materials for longer than any other civilization of men had existed. Fabrics that felt like nothing fabric had any right to feel like. Metalwork of a precision that made the best work of other people look approximate. Food grown in soil that had been tended for generations by people who understood what soil needed in a way that could not be taught quickly because the teaching required the time that only Numenorians had. All of it gone. Every craft and every recipe and every refinement accumulated across centuries of patient work, gone with the island into water that does not know what it covers. In the last years, the love became grief before the grief had anything to attach to, a foreboding with no specific object. The city was still beautiful. The harbour still functioned. The bread still smelled like bread, and the stone still gave back its warmth at night. But something had changed in the quality of the air, in the way people moved through the streets, in the specific register of the conversations you could hear at the dockside taverns if you sat quietly and listened. Fear. Not the fear of a specific threat. The fear of something coming that nobody could name and everybody could feel. I had heard enough, across enough visits, to understand the shape of it without understanding the full depth. The king's men and their religion, the burning on the mountaintop, the pressure on the faithful who still looked west and still maintained the old allegiances. The name of the giver of gifts, spoken openly now in the upper city, in the temples that had no business existing on that island, with a reverence that turned my stomach in a way I could not fully account for, given that I was not a political man and had never considered myself a religious one. My last visit to Numenor was in the autumn of the year it ended. I did not know it was my last visit. I did not know it was anyone's last visit. I loaded my cargo, conducted my business, ate my meals, slept in my usual lodgings near the eastern dock, and prepared to depart. On the morning I left, the armada was in the harbour. I want to stop here, because the armada deserves its account, and because the armada is the key to understanding everything that followed, the key to understanding what I witnessed at sea 3 days later. The key to understanding why the world is the shape it is now, rather than the shape it was when I was born into it. Ar-Pharazôn had built the greatest fleet in the history of the world. This is not an exaggeration, and I am not a man given to exaggeration. I had seen large fleets. I had seen the assembled naval power of kingdoms and had been impressed, and had filed the impression and moved on. What was in the harbour of Ravenna, and in every harbour on every coast of Numenor that morning, was of a different order than any of that. It occupied the water, the way weather occupies the sky. Not a thing you look at, but a condition of the environment, something the scale of which you could not take in at once because your field of vision was not large enough to contain it. The ships were the greatest ships ever built. The Numenorians had always been shipbuilders beyond any other people in the world, their craft refined across generations by minds that had more time than other minds to refine it. These were the product of that tradition, brought to its furthest possible expression, enormous and yet graceful in the way that things are graceful when they have been designed by people who understand completely what they are designing. The black sails of Ar-Pharazôn's fleet catching the morning wind and filling with it one after another down the line of the harbour until the whole surface of the water was shadow. I stood on the dock, and I watched them prepare to sail, and I felt something I could not name then, and can name now, only as wrongness. Not the wrongness of a bad decision, though it was that. The wrongness of a thing moving toward a consequence that is too large to be contained by ordinary consequence. The wrongness of a tide that is going to break something that has not been broken before and will not be breakable again. I watched them go for longer than made sense, given that I had a ship to prepare and a tide to catch. Something kept me on the dock. The specific quality of watching something enormous move that should not be moving, that has no business being in motion, that the world would be better served by keeping still. Ship after ship after ship, the line of them extending beyond the harbour mouth and into the open sea, the black sails filling and darkening the water, and then the sky as they caught the wind and committed to the direction they had chosen, west, toward the place where the rules about what was possible were kept, toward the home of powers that had made this world and everything in it, and had been patient with men for longer than men had any right to expect, and had reached the end of whatever patience looked like for something that old and that large. I did not know that is what they were sailing toward. Not in those terms. I knew the broad shape of it, the hubris of it, the specific flavor of an ambition that had decided the limits placed on it were unjust rather than given. But the full weight of what sailing west toward the undying lands with the intention of conquest actually meant, the specific theology of the mistake, the nature of what it was a rejection of, I understood that only later. Standing on the dock, I understood only that something was ending, that the armada moving out of the harbour and into the open sea was the last movement of something that had been building for a long time and had finally reached the point where it could only move in one direction. They sailed west. I watched the armada leave Numenor, and I loaded the last of my cargo, and I sailed east, and I didn't look back, and 3 days later, the world ended. I had been asleep in my bunk when it began. Not the wave, not yet. Something before the wave. Something that entered sleep before it entered waking and produced in the sleeping mind an experience that I have no language for, because the sleeping mind has no language for things that have no precedent. A dream that was not a dream, a sensation of something vast and attentive, turning its attention toward this particular corner of existence, a quality of being noticed by something so large that the noticing itself was a physical sensation. I came awake already moving toward the deck. The sky was wrong first. Not wrong in the way of an approaching storm. I had seen 1,000 approaching storms, and I knew that wrongness intimately. Wrong in a way that had no previous entry in any catalogue of wrongness I possessed. the stars in the wrong positions for the hour, not by a small margin of navigational error, but fundamentally, structurally wrong, as if the map of the sky had been shifted by a hand that had not finished shifting it, the light not quite matching any hour of night or dawn or day that I had ever observed. A quality of illumination that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, and therefore from nowhere in particular, sourceless, directionless, as if the relationship between light and the objects that produce it had been briefly suspended. I opened my mouth to call to the watch and heard nothing. Not silence, the absence of the mechanism by which silence and sound are distinguished. My throat moving, my lungs pushing air, and nothing arriving. Not the muffled nothing of ears stopped by pressure or water. The nothing of sound not existing in this particular moment, in this particular location. The air present, the vibration present, the physical process of producing sound occurring, and the sound itself simply not there. Around me, the crew were moving. I could see their mouths open. I could see the terror on their faces that told me they were screaming. I could hear nothing. Then the water. The water was not water. The precision will not be adequate. Attempting it anyway. The water around the ship was still present. The substance was there. The visual evidence of it was there. The surface, the color, the movement. But the properties of water, the things that make water what it is rather than merely what it looks like, were absent. The ship sitting on it, without the ship sitting on it. The relationship between hull and sea that a sailor feels through the soles of his feet at every moment of every voyage. The constant subtle communication between the vessel and the element it moves through, simply gone. We were not floating. We were not sinking. We were in a relationship with the substance beneath us that had no name because it had never existed before. The ship rose, not on a wave, not lifted by any force I could identify as a force. The ship rose the way things rise in dreams, without mechanism, without the physics of rising, simply ascending while the sea remained where the sea had been, and I stood on the deck of a ship suspended above the water, and I looked at the sky, and I looked at the sea, and I understood, with a completeness that bypassed the part of the mind that requires explanation, that what was happening was not a thing happening in the world. It was a thing happening to the world. The pause lasted forever. The pause lasted no time at all. Both of these are true, and neither of them is adequate. Time had become unreliable. The relationship between one moment and the next, the mechanism by which duration is experienced, had ceased to function with its usual consistency, and in the gap between one heartbeat and the next I existed for what felt like years, and for what felt like less than a breath simultaneously. The crew around me frozen in attitudes of terror that had no time to complete themselves. The sails above me full of a wind that was not moving. The sea below me present and absent in the same instant. The crew around me had stopped, not frozen in any ordinary sense, not paralyzed by fear, though fear was present in all of us. Stopped in the way that everything had stopped. The mechanism of movement paused along with the mechanism of sound and the mechanism of time, all of us existing in the interval between one moment and the next, that had stretched itself beyond any interval that intervals were supposed to reach. I looked at my hands. I do not know why. Perhaps because they were the most immediately present thing, the thing closest to me, the thing I could be most certain of. My hands were there. The evidence of them was present, but the quality of them, the weight of them, the specific relationship between my hands and gravity and the air around them was absent in the same way the water's quality had been absent. The form of things persisted. The substance of things had been suspended. And in that suspension, in that pause that was not a pause, something. And in that suspension, in that pause that was not a pause, something. Not a presence you could point to. Not a light or a voice or any form that the mind can hold and examine. Something more fundamental than any of those things. The specific quality of an attention so vast that the world and everything in it was less than a detail of it, turned, for an interval outside measurement, toward this corner of existence. Not toward me, specifically. Not toward any particular thing. Toward everything, simultaneously, and with a completeness that made the word everything feel too small. I have spent the rest of my life trying to describe what it felt like to be within that attention, and I have never found the words, and I will not find them now. The closest I have come is this. You know the feeling of being in a room where something very important is being decided, where the air itself seems weighted with consequence, where you do not speak because speaking would be wrong, where even breathing seems like an intrusion on something that requires silence to complete itself. Take that feeling and remove every human scale element from it. Remove the room. Remove the people. Remove everything that makes the feeling comprehensible by providing it with boundaries. Leave only the quality of it, the specific weight of enormous consequence being determined by something with the authority to determine it. That is the closest I can come. Then the world moved. I do not mean the wave, though the wave came. I mean the world. I felt it beneath the ship and beneath the sea and beneath everything, the fundamental substrate of physical existence. Shift. Not shake, not tremble, not convulse. Shift. The way you shift a weight from one hand to another, with intention, with control, with the specific quality of movement that comes from something that knows exactly what it is doing and is doing it completely. The horizon curved. I was a sailor. The horizon was the most constant thing in my existence. I had looked at it every day of my working life, and I knew it the way you know your own face, intimately and without having to think about it. And I watched it, in the moment the world moved, describe a curve that it had never described before, not the curve of an optical illusion or the distortion of heat haze or any of the phenomena that can make a flat line appear to bend. A real curve, a structural curve, the actual shape of the world's edge changing while I was looking at it, the flat becoming round in a moment, the geometry of everything rewritten between one breath and the next. And then the clock started again. Sound arrived all at once, the full volume of everything that had been occurring in the silence, the wind and the sea, and the screaming of 9 men, arriving simultaneously in a single overwhelming wave of noise that was almost physical in its impact. Gravity reasserted itself, and the ship dropped, and the water was water again, and the sea was the sea again, except that it was not the sea it had been, because the sea it had been was part of a flat world, and the sea it was now was part of a round one, and the difference was everything. The wave came from the west. I have said it was not what I remember most, and that is true, but it deserves its account. The wall of water that the drowning of Numenor sent across the sea was not a wave in any sense that the word wave had previously carried. It was the ocean responding to the removal of a landmass the size of a kingdom, the water rushing to fill the absence of an entire island, and the energy of that response propagating outward in every direction at a speed that made navigation irrelevant. I will not tell you how we survived it. I do not fully know how we survived it. I know that the ship rode something rather than being broken by something, that there was a moment of vertical movement so extreme that the sea was below us and the sky was below us simultaneously, and that when it was over, we were still present and moving, and the world around us was unrecognizable. I turned west. Where Numenor had been there was open water, not damaged water, not churned water in the aftermath of a catastrophe. Open water. The specific quality of a surface that has been that surface for a long time, undisturbed, unremarkable. The ordinary water of the open sea, where an island the size of a kingdom had been visible from this distance on every previous voyage I had made in these waters. Gone. Not sunk, though it had sunk. Not drowned, though it had drowned. The word that kept arriving in my mind was erased. The island hadn't been destroyed. It had been removed. The distinction felt important then, and has continued to feel important in all the years since. Destruction leaves evidence. Ruins, debris, the physical remnant of something that existed and was broken. There was no remnant. There was water where the water had not been, and the rest was absence. I stood at the stern of my ship, and I looked at the open sea where Numenor had been, and I thought about the armada. Our Pharazôn's fleet, the greatest ever assembled, sailing west toward the undying lands with the intention of claiming immortality through force. I thought about what that fleet must have encountered when it reached its destination, what response the assault on the blessed realm had provoked, what it had set in motion that had moved through the world and arrived here as the drowning of everything I had ever known. I had been told, in the way that sailors are told things, in taverns and on docks, and in the half-heard conversations of people who are not speaking to you, but are speaking near you, about the old beliefs, the faithful, and their westward prayers, their refusal of the king's men and their new religion, their insistence that the gifts that had been given to Numenor were not owed, but granted, not permanent, but conditional. I had not been a religious man. I had not been a faithful. I had been a merchant sailor who understood the sea and understood commerce, and had allowed the theology of the island to exist at a distance from the practical business of his life. Floating on the water above where Numenor used to be, I understood something that I hadn't understood before. The Valar were not what had done this. That was the first thing I understood, and it was the thing that took the longest to fully integrate, because it was the largest. The Valar were the powers of the world, the great ones, the shapers of the physical landscape, and the guardians of the blessed realm that the armada had sailed to assault. They were beyond anything I had previously had occasion to think about seriously. They were a category of being that made kings and dark lords and every human power I had any experience of seem like something happening in a very small room. They had not done this. What had done this was something for which the Valar themselves were the way that I was for our Pharazôn's fleet, a category of being so far beyond them that the comparison did not hold. The one who had made the world, not shaped it, not ordered it, not governed it within its existing rules, but made it, called it into existence from nothing, conceived the entirety of physical reality as an act of creative will, and then built it. That was what had turned its attention to this corner of existence in the moment the world paused. That was what I had felt in the suspension, in the interval outside time, in the quality of attention that had no human scale and no human vocabulary. The maker of everything, for the first and only time in the history of the world, reaching into what he had made and changing it directly. Not through the Valar, not through any intermediary, not through the operation of the rules he had established, directly. His own hand, not a hand, the thing that hands are a small version of, present in the physical world, rearranging it. Because nothing else could have addressed what our Pharazôn had done. The Vala could have destroyed the fleet. The Vala could have defended the Blessed Realm. But the assault on the Undying Lands was not merely a military event. It was a statement about the nature of the world, a claim that the gifts given to men, the gifts that had included a life longer than other men, but not the endless life of the elves, were insufficient, were unjust, were to be corrected by force. It was a rejection of the terms on which existence had been offered. You cannot answer that with a storm. You cannot answer that with a military defeat. You can only answer it by changing the terms themselves. The world was changed, the Undying Lands removed from the circles of the world entirely, no longer accessible by any road that could be sailed or walked. The world made round, the flat map that every sailor had ever used made obsolete in a moment, the routes that had been memorized across generations of navigators, no longer connecting the places they had connected, because the shape of the thing they crossed had been revised. The gift of a straight road to the west, which had always existed for the elves, and had been used by those among men whom the Valar chose to call, closed. Not blocked. Closed, the door removed, not locked, a statement as large as the rejection it was answering. Before I sailed east, I stayed where I was for a long time. Long enough that the waves' effects had settled, and the sea had returned to something approaching ordinary behavior, and the crew had done what crews do after surviving the unsurvivable, which is sit very still and breathe and look at each other and not speak, because speaking would require the assembly of words, and the assembly of words would require the mind to be functioning in the ordinary way, and none of our minds were functioning in the ordinary way. We sat on a sea that was the same sea it had always been, and a completely different sea simultaneously. The water, the sky, the wind, all present and behaving as water and sky and wind behave, and the horizon curved, and to the west where Numenor had been, there was nothing, and all of it together added up to a world that was made of the same materials as the world we had woken up in that morning, and was not that world at all. One of the crew, a young man from the southern coast, whose name I will not give here, because his family still lives, and this account is mine to give but his is not, looked at the western horizon for a long time, and then looked at me and said nothing. The look contained everything. The question of what had happened, and the knowledge that no answer I could give would be adequate, and the mutual understanding that we were going to have to continue existing in the world that had replaced the one we knew, and that continuing to exist in it was the only available option. I nodded. He nodded back. We started the ship moving east. I sailed east. I had nowhere else to sail. The world to the west of me was gone. The world to the east of me was the only world remaining, and I pointed my ship toward it, and I tried to remember how to navigate in a world that was no longer the shape I had learned to navigate. The curved horizon was the hardest thing. I know how that sounds. Of everything I have described, the drowning of Numenor, the pausing of the world, the direct intervention of the one who made everything, the thing that continued to be hardest was the horizon, because I had looked at that line every day of my working life, and it had always been flat, and now it was not flat, and every time I looked at it, I felt the world change again, felt the moment repeat, felt the specific quality of reality being revised by something that had the authority to revise it. I sail still. I am old now in a way that men are old, not in the long, graceful way of the Numenorians I grew up around, the ones who carried their years lightly and seemed to belong to a different relationship with time than the one I had been born into. I sail on a round world with a curved horizon, and I navigate by stars that are in slightly different positions than they were when I was young. Because when the world changed, shape the sky changed with it. I have told this account to perhaps a dozen people across the years. Most of them received it in the way that people receive accounts of things too large to fully believe, with a specific quality of suspended judgment, the polite expression of someone who is not calling you a liar, but is reserving a portion of their certainty for the possibility that you might be wrong. I understand this. I would have received it the same way before I was the one telling it. What I know is what I felt in the moment. The world paused. The specific quality of an attention that had no size I could measure, present in the world it had made, doing what only it had the authority to do. Not angry, not wrathful in any human sense of those words. Something more absolute than anger. The correction of something that had moved outside the terms of its own existence and required not punishment, but revision. Ar-Pharazôn wanted to be more than what he was. He assembled the greatest force in the history of the world and sailed it toward the place where the rules about what men could be were kept, intending to change those rules by force. He wanted the world to be different than the world was. He got his wish. The world is different. It is round now where it was flat. The road west is closed. The island where the greatest civilization of men existed is open water, deep water, water that has been water long enough that there is nothing left beneath it that remembers being anything else. I was there when it changed. I felt the pause, the attention, the revision. I sail on the world that came after. The horizon curves away from me in every direction, and I have sailed far enough that I know now it curves all the way around, that if you sail long enough in one direction, you arrive at where you began from the other side, that the world is a closed shape, and everything in it is contained within that shape, and the shape was chosen, deliberately, by the one who made it, on a morning when I was 3 days east of Numenor on a merchant run, and the sea stopped being the sea. I think about that morning every day. I think about the armada sailing west into something it had no capacity to understand. I think about the specific hubris of it, the scale of the ambition and the scale of the misunderstanding it represented, the belief that the rules governing what men were and what men could become were negotiable, were obstacles rather than gifts, were to be overcome rather than accepted. I think about the pause, the moment outside time, the quality of attention I felt in it that had no human measure. And I think about what it means that it happened once, only once, in all of history, all the ages of the world, all the dark lords and wars and catastrophes, and the accumulated weight of everything that has happened since the world was made. The one who made it has reached into it directly and changed it on exactly one occasion. What Ar-Pharazôn did was the one thing that required that response. The assault on the undying lands, the rejection of the terms of existence by the greatest power men had ever assembled, was the single event in the history of the world that could not be addressed by any other means. I was on the water when it happened. I saw the horizon change. I sail the round world every day, and I have never, in all the years since, looked at the sea without feeling it. The specific quality of that pause, the presence that was not a presence, the attention that was not an attention, the Intervention of something so far beyond the powers of the world that those powers themselves were not adequate to the moment. It happened once. I was there. The water is still not quite the same water it was before that morning. Or perhaps I am not quite the same sailor. The sea that I sail now is the sea of a revised world, a world that carries in its current shape the evidence of a single moment of direct action by the one who made it, and that evidence is written in the curve of the horizon that I see every morning when I come up from below and look west. West, where Numenor was. West, where the road is closed. West, where the greatest single act of power in the history of Middle-earth happened on a morning when I was nobody in particular, a merchant sailor 3 days out on a routine run, too far east to drown and close enough to feel the world change beneath my feet. I have never decided whether I was fortunate or otherwise. I sail anyway.